Libya is a country with a continuous conflict that has been going on for about 15 years. During this period, Libya has turned into a battlefield for armed militias, terrorist groups, and foreign powers, so that Libya has lived through one of the worst periods in its history. Currently, there are two sides in a continuous conflict, and each side believes that it is the one that must be in control of power. But the question that arises the most at the present time is, how did Libya reach this stage? To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the beginning of the 20th century, specifically to 1911. At that time, Italy launched a military invasion of Libya, which was under the control of the Ottoman Empire. Italy succeeded in occupying Libya after a year-long war. Italy was dealing with Libya as part of the Italian territories, and its first goal was to control agricultural lands and expand in Africa. That is why about 150,000 Italians settled in Libya, and at that time, they represented about 20% of the population. If we look at the population distribution map of Libya, we will find that the vast majority of the population lives in the north on the Mediterranean coast. The first region is in the northwest, where Tripoli, the capital of Libya and its largest city, is located, and the second region is in the northeast, where Benghazi, the second largest city in Libya, is located. As for the part between the two regions on the coast of the Gulf of Sidra, it is inhabited by a smaller number of people because this area is more inland, and therefore, the marine influences that reach it are less. Apart from these areas on the Mediterranean coast, the lands of Libya are a dry desert where a very small number of people live and are almost completely devoid of any form of urban development. If we look at the distribution map of mountains in Libya, we will find that the area in the far north, in the east and west, where the vast majority of the population lives, are areas that are largely elevated, especially the area in the east known as the Green Mountain. The mountains in northern Libya absorb the moisture that comes from the Mediterranean Sea and condense it through the wind, and this leads to rain falling on the small area located on the Mediterranean coast. In addition, the height of the mountains above sea level makes the weather in them much better than in areas located at the same sea level. Therefore, the weather here is much better than in other areas of Libya, especially the Green Mountain region in northeastern Libya, which has fertile soil, green spaces, and forests and trees that extend over large areas, and this makes managing or even monitoring it a very difficult task. That is why the Libyan resistance appeared in this region, led by Sheikh Omar al-Mukhtar, who carried out acts of war against the Italian occupation. At that time, the Italian occupation carried out mass executions of civilians, established concentration camps, and displaced the population. And death camps were established in the desert with the aim of ending Omar al-Mukhtar's resistance and isolating him from the support of the Libyan tribes. At that time, Libya lost a large number of its population, and Libyans were forced to emigrate to neighboring countries. In 1931, the resistance leader Sheikh Omar al-Mukhtar was executed in front of 200,000 locals, so that Italy would declare victory after about 20 years from the beginning of the occupation. But after that, the resistance continued. During the Italian occupation, specifically in 1942, Muammar Gaddafi was born into one of the Bedouin tribes that was facing persecution from Italian soldiers. A year later, the Allied forces succeeded in defeating Italy, which had joined Nazi Germany during World War II. After that, Libya was divided between Britain, which controlled Tripoli and Cyrenaica, and France, which controlled Fezzan. 6 years later, the United Nations issued a resolution stipulating that Libya should be an independent state before January 1952. That is why, on December 24th, 1951, Libya declared its independence under the name of the United Kingdom of Libya, and King Idris al-Senussi took power, who had popularity within Libya and acceptance from Western countries. At that time, Libya was home to about 1 million people, and it was one of the poorest countries in the world, and it depended on foreign aid and the rent of foreign military bases. But in 1958, oil was discovered, so Libya entered the era of the oil industry, and overnight, it was transformed from a poor country to a country that possessed treasures under the desert. In 1964, Libya began to use oil revenues to develop and build the state and improve the quality of life, and this made the economic situation in the country improve. But in 1969, a military coup took place in Libya, led by Muammar Gaddafi against King Idris, so that Gaddafi would seize power when he was only 27 years old. And one of the people who helped Gaddafi was Khalifa Haftar, who was about 26 years old at the time. After Gaddafi took power, he ordered the end of the presence of American and British military bases in Libya, the expulsion of Italians and the Jewish community, and he opposed Zionism and Israel, and he began to nationalize oil, banks, and insurance companies. In 1973, relations between Gaddafi and his friends in the army who helped him in the coup against the king and his rise to power became tense, so they asked him to resign because they saw that he was not the right person to rule Libya. Gaddafi agreed to resign and told them that he would go out himself and announce to the people that he was stepping down from power. And indeed, Gaddafi gave a public speech in the city of Zawara, and instead of announcing his resignation, he started a revolution that he called the Cultural Revolution, and he announced the suspension of all laws, the end of all political parties, the purification of Libya from traitors and supporters of the king, and he asked the people to occupy state institutions and to secure himself against any coup. He replaced all army commanders with older people, and this made the Libyan army weaker. From that time on, Libya became a country owned by Gaddafi, and the fate of any opponent was either imprisonment or execution. At the same time, Libya began to export oil in large quantities and use the revenues to develop health, education, and services. Libya's wealth increased, and the economy began to grow significantly. That is why Libya needed foreign labor to exploit the large oil reserves. The population of Libya increased after many people emigrated to it for work, and Libya was transformed from a country with limited resources to an open labor market that included many nationalities, so that the population of Libya doubled after less than 20 years from the discovery of oil. At that time, the per capita income in Libya began to rise, reaching more than $11,000 in 1977, and this made the population of Libya double for the second time within 20 years. At that time, there was not enough water in Libya for this large number of people. That is why Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi, built the largest water transport project in the history of mankind, the Great Man-Made River Project, the cost of which reached about $35 billion, to transport more than 6 million cubic meters of groundwater daily from the desert through pipes extending for a distance of up to 4,000 kilometers from the south to the north. At that time, Gaddafi issued one of the strangest laws you might ever hear about, the House for its Resident Law. This law allowed anyone living in a rented house to take control of it. This law deprived property owners of their homes, lands, and cars, without even compensating them, and they were only entitled to the house they lived in and the car they used. At the same time, Gaddafi asked workers and employees to seize institutions, factories, and private property, and asked them to take control of them and manage them themselves. Gaddafi was very impressed with the Egyptian president Gamal Abdel Nasser and the idea of Arab nationalism, and considered him a role model, to the extent that he named the month of July after Nasser's death. Gaddafi's relationship was strong with the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, and Gaddafi asked him that Libya and Egypt unite into one state. But in 1977, Egypt began to prepare for a peace treaty with Israel, and this caused relations to become tense between the two countries. Gaddafi rejected the treaty and expelled about 250,000 Egyptians who were working in Libya. He asked Libyans to go out in a march and storm the Egyptian border. Every country then deployed its military forces on the border, and then Gaddafi ordered the bombing of the Egyptian city of Saloum, so that a war broke out between the two countries. The war lasted for 4 days, and hundreds from both countries were killed. And in the end, an agreement was reached on a ceasefire, so that relations between Egypt and Libya were suspended for 12 years. Gaddafi began to use Libya's wealth to interfere in the affairs of the countries around him and to enter into wars. And one of these countries was Chad, which was suffering at the time from a civil war. The war between Libya and Chad lasted for years after Libya took control of the Ozu Strip, and during the war, France supported Chad against Libya. The war ended with the defeat of Libya, and thousands of soldiers were killed, and hundreds of soldiers were captured. In addition to the commander of the Libyan forces in the war, Colonel Khalifa Haftar, but Gaddafi disowned Haftar and the Libyan prisoners. After that, Haftar traveled to America, took American citizenship, and began to oppose Gaddafi. In the area between Benghazi in the east and Tripoli in the west, there is the Gulf of Sidra, which Gaddafi declared was part of Libya, and therefore, entering this area without permission was considered an aggression against Libyan sovereignty. That is why Gaddafi defined the line you see in front of you and called it the line of death. To cross this line, you need permission from the Libyan authorities. Otherwise, anyone who crosses the line will face death. But America considered the Gulf of Sidra international waters and that it had the right to pass through it. That is why it violated the airspace and territorial waters of the Gulf of Sidra, and the matter turned into armed clashes between the Libyan and American forces. After that, American planes bombed Tripoli and Benghazi, and the residential complex where Gaddafi lived was bombed. These raids killed about 60 Libyan citizens, including Muammar Gaddafi's adopted daughter, Hana Gaddafi, who was only 15 months old. America accused Gaddafi of supporting armed groups outside Libya and added Libya to the list of states that support terrorism, and imposed economic sanctions on Libya and prevented the export of weapons to it, and froze its assets in American banks. And this caused the Libyan economy to lose billions of dollars. Muammar Gaddafi was a strange personality, and his statements were always unexpected. And literally, at every occasion he attended, you had to find either a strange or a comical situation.
زيادة المقاعد يزيد الطين بلة. أنا ما بعرف المترجم كيف ترجم الطين بلة هذه مثل يصعب ترجمتها بالإنجليزي يعني، لكن المساعدة كان فيها هي to add insult to injury.
In the Arab League, Gaddafi used to deal with Arab leaders with sarcasm, and he always used to belittle them and their appearance.
احنا لبعضنا، احنا كلنا نكره بعضنا ونتخاصم مع بعضنا ونكيد لبعضنا ونشمت في بعضنا، ما في حاجة تجمعنا أبدا إلا القاعة هذه.
At the same time, Gaddafi always had solutions for all complex issues, and he always thought differently.
الفلسطينيين والإسرائيليين يعملوا دولة ديمقراطية واحدة. فأنا قدمت لكم حل، وقدمت حتى للعالم ما يسمى بالكتاب الأبيض الأخير. وهذا الكتاب الأبيض، هذا الكتاب الأبيض فيه الحل إسرائيل. بعدين يا علي بشر.
He also always boasted that he was the king of kings of Africa and the dean of Arab rulers.
وعميد الحكام العرب وملك ملوك أفريقيا وإمام المسلمين. مكانتي العالمية ما تسمح لي إني أنا ننزل لأي مستوى آخر، وشكرا.
But at the same time, he refused to be called the president of Libya because Libya is a Jamahiriya, state of the masses, and power is in the hands of the people.
لا يعني أنا تركت السلطة من عام 77.
So you are not the leader of your country.
أنت ما تقودش لا أنا قائد الثورة مش قائد البلد.
In Benghazi, in 1976, there were protests from students due to the backward school curricula, but many students were arrested and sentenced to death, and students were forced to attend the executions of their colleagues. And these executions were carried out in public squares and universities, and were broadcast live. In 1996, the biggest crime in Gaddafi's era occurred in Abu Salim prison. There were a large number of detainees who were being tortured without being tried. The detainees demanded that their conditions be improved and that they be brought before a court, but none of this happened until June 28, 1996. At that time, large protests took place from the detainees inside the prison, and they held 2 prison guards hostage, and one of them died. In return, 6 of the detainees were killed. So a government delegation was sent to negotiate with the detainees, and in the end, the delegation agreed to the detainees' demands, and the detainees agreed to release the guard they had with them. The very next day, the detainees were asked to leave their cells and go to the prison yard. At that time, machine guns were opened on all the detainees for a full hour, so that more than 1,200 people were killed in this massacre. During his rule that lasted for about 42 years, Gaddafi prevented anyone in Libya from objecting and he turned into a person above any criticism, and he considered anyone who opposed him a traitor and an enemy of the nation. In 2011, large popular protests took place in many Arab countries, the protests that were known at the time as the Arab Spring. In Tunisia, the regime of President Zine El Abidine Ben Ali fell, and in Egypt, the regime of President Hosni Mubarak fell. Then it was Libya's and Muammar Gaddafi's turn. 3 days after the start of the revolution in Egypt, specifically on January 28th, a Libyan activist named Hassan al-Jahmi created a page on Facebook and asked Libyans to take to the streets and start a revolution against the regime of Muammar Gaddafi, and he set February 17th as the date for the start of the uprising. But 2 days before the date of the uprising, Chachi Fatih Terbil, who was responsible for the Abu Salim prison case, was arrested. So thousands took to the streets on February 15th and demanded his release. And this was the first spark of the beginning of the Libyan Revolution. On the scheduled date, which was February 17th, Libyans began to take to the streets against the Gaddafi regime, and the protests began to spread gradually throughout Libya, so that the Libyan Revolution finally began against the regime of Muammar Gaddafi. At that time, the Gaddafi regime confronted the protests with violence, and live bullets were used, and the arrest campaign against the revolutionaries began. And the matter reached the point of bombing the protests with planes, so that hundreds of Libyans were killed as a result of this violence. With the continuation of the protests, elements of the army and police began to defect and join the opposition, and the Libyan tribes began to join the demonstrations, so that the revolutionaries succeeded in controlling the city of Benghazi. At that time, the revolutionaries took control of the weapons depots, and armed militias were formed, so that a civil war began in Libya between the revolutionaries and the supporters of Muammar Gaddafi. With the continuation of the protests, Muammar Gaddafi's son, Saif al-Islam, appeared and gave a message to the people.
إن ليبيا مش تونس ومصر، ليبيا قبائل وعشائر، وكل واحد قاعد في منطقته، كل واحد عارف هلا، كل واحد عارف ناسه. ليبيا تصبح حرب أهلية. نرجع للحرب الأهلية بتاع 1936. هنقتل بعضنا في الشوارع.
But after the speech, the protests increased and spread more in the capital, Tripoli, and opponents began to burn many of the government buildings in the city. At that time, news began to spread that Gaddafi had left Libya and traveled to Venezuela. But Gaddafi appeared and gave a speech to the Libyan people.
لا يمكن نسمح لليبيا تضيع بين يدينا بدون مبرر. قد تندمون يوم لا ينفع الندم.
With the continuation of the protests, Gaddafi began to lose control of the situation in many Libyan cities, and within just 1 week, Gaddafi lost control of most of the lands of Cyrenaica in eastern Libya. At that time, the revolutionaries established the Libyan Interim National Council, and the establishment of the Libyan Liberation Army was announced to confront Muammar Gaddafi. Gaddafi tried to regain his strength again after the successive defeats he suffered, and he began a counter-offensive in eastern Libya. And in early March, his forces began to advance towards the city of Benghazi, the main city in eastern Libya, which is considered the main stronghold of the revolutionaries. And here, it began to seem that eliminating the revolution was only a matter of time. But at that time, a new opponent appeared to Gaddafi, who changed all his calculations. On March 17th, the UN Security Council announced a no-fly zone over Libya, and after that, Gaddafi's forces around Benghazi were targeted by airstrikes, so that the international coalition forces announced that they had succeeded in stopping the attack on the city. And here, Gaddafi's forces began to lose control and withdraw from most Libyan cities. After that, the revolutionaries began to advance westward to finally take control of the capital, Tripoli, and a number of Libyan cities. Here, Gaddafi tried to escape from Tripoli towards the city of Sirte, but at that time, international coalition forces spotted a convoy of 50 cars moving at high speed, and an airstrike from the air coalition was directed towards the convoy. After the cars were destroyed, Gaddafi tried to escape, and according to witnesses, Gaddafi took refuge in a sewer pipe at that time, but in the end, Gaddafi was arrested by the revolutionaries, and then Gaddafi was killed, so that Gaddafi's rule, which had lasted for more than 42 years, ended, and the Libyan Revolution officially ended after about 25,000 Libyans were killed. After the end of the Libyan Revolution, the Interim Council made a temporary constitution for Libya until a new constitution was made and the people voted on it. And in July 2012, parliamentary elections were held for the House of Representatives, which is called the General National Congress, and its main task was to make a new constitution so that the Interim Council would then hand over power to the National Congress headed by Mohammed el-Magariaf, and a government would be formed headed by Ali Zaidan. At that time, the armed militias that had formed in Libya refused to hand over their weapons, and the Libyan government existed only on paper. But the ones who were actually ruling Libya were the armed militias. And here, there were many parties in Libya that possessed power and money, and almost all of them had the goal of reaching power by any means. In 2012, the Ansar al-Sharia group carried out an assassination against the US ambassador to Libya, and a year later, the Libyan prime minister was kidnapped in Tripoli, but in the end, he was freed. And then the General National Congress building was stormed with weapons, and at least 2 deputies were injured, so that Libya entered a state of chaos, and it was clear to everyone that the armed militias were almost ruling Libya. The chaos and instability continued in Libya, so that this was the most suitable time for Khalifa Haftar to return to the picture again. Haftar returned to Libya in 2011 at the time of the revolution against Gaddafi, and at that time, he joined the revolutionaries and took the position of commander of the ground forces with the rank of lieutenant general. But in the end, he did not find a place for himself in the new government, so he decided to return to America again. In early 2014, Haftar returned to Libya again after the National Congress extended its term. At that time, Haftar appeared and called for a rebellion against the National Congress and new elections. But the interim government considered Haftar a rebel and accused him of trying to carry out a military coup. In May 2014, Haftar began Operation Dignity against the armed militias in Benghazi. At that time, he was supported by Egypt, the UAE, and Russia. And here, many militias began to join the Libyan National Army under the command of Haftar. Finally, in June 2014, new parliamentary elections were held in Libya, but the participation rate in these elections was very low and did not exceed 18%. The Islamic current suffered a major loss in the elections, and they refused to recognize the results. That is why they announced Operation Libya Dawn and took control of the city of Tripoli and announced the return of the old parliament again, which is the General National Congress. At that time, the elected parliament moved towards the east to the areas controlled by Haftar, so that the parliament's headquarters would be in the city of Tobruk. In November 2014, the Supreme Court in Tripoli, which is controlled by the new General National Congress, announced the dissolution of the new House of Representatives and considered it an illegitimate institution. But the House of Representatives rejected the ruling and described it as having been issued under threat. And here, Libya became divided into 2 parts. The western part has a parliament in Tripoli, and it has a government, and it has an army. And the eastern part has a parliament in Tobruk that is recognized internationally, and it also has a government. And it has an army led by Khalifa Haftar, who is almost the first ruler of the East and the owner of the first and last decision in everything. And here, a war began between the 2 sides known as the Second Civil War. During this war, many parties entered the conflict, the most important of which were the Ansar al-Sharia group and the Islamic State organization, which announced their control over Sirte, Derna, and part of Benghazi. But in the end, these forces were successfully expelled from the Libyan cities. In 2016, the conflict continued between Haftar's forces, which control the east, and the forces that control western Libya, until 2015. At that time, the 2 sides signed the Skhirat Agreement in Morocco to form a unified government for all of Libya under the name of the Government of National Accord, and its headquarters would be Tripoli. But after that, the old government that was in Tripoli returned again because it saw that the Government of National Accord had failed in its mission. And in the east, Khalifa Haftar announced the overthrow of the Skhirat Agreement and announced his acceptance of the people's mandate to rule Libya, so that at that time, the conflict was between 3 parties, Haftar in the east, and the Government of National Accord and the Government of National Salvation in the west. But in the end, the Government of National Accord succeeded in eliminating the old government in the West. And here, a new conflict began between the internationally recognized Government of National Accord in the West and Khalifa Haftar and his government and the Tobruk Parliament in the East. During the conflict, Russia increased its support for Khalifa Haftar and sent him weapons and soldiers from the Wagner Group. In January 2019, Haftar headed to southwestern Libya and announced that his goal was to eliminate terrorist groups. And in the end, Haftar succeeded in controlling the city of Sabha and the oil fields surrounding it. In April 2019, Haftar's forces began to head towards the city of Tripoli, and Haftar actually began to impose a siege on Tripoli, and it became clear that Haftar would finally take control of all of Libya's lands. But at that time, the Government of National Accord, led by al-Sarraj, used the only card in their hand, so that Turkey appeared on the scene at that time publicly. In November 2019, Turkey signed a maritime border demarcation agreement with Libya, and this would allow Turkey to exploit the gas reserves in the Mediterranean Sea and would allow the Government of National Accord to increase oil and gas production and increase its revenues to support its declining economy due to the war. After that, in January 2020, Turkey signed a military cooperation agreement with the Government of National Accord, and thanks to the Turkish support, Haftar's forces were expelled from the capital, Tripoli, so that the Government of National Accord regained control of the lands in western Libya. In the end, the two sides signed a ceasefire agreement in October 2020, and it was agreed to form a national unity government to rule all of Libya. But in September 2020, the Tobruk Parliament issued a decision to withdraw confidence from Prime Minister Abdulhamid Dbeibeh, and the appointment of Fathi Bashaga as Prime Minister was announced. But Prime Minister Dbeibeh rejected the decision because it was void, and announced that he would not leave power until after the parliamentary and presidential elections. Fathi Bashaga headed to Tripoli to take over the responsibility, but in the end, he was expelled from the capital. And here, the division returned again in Libya, and the presidential elections were postponed, and no one knows their date until now. That's it. We have reached the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and activate the bell to receive all new content. Goodbye.